we look at the opposite sex as we would normally function and operate. So if I'm a guy, I try to understand women through my perspective of how I function and operate. And a lot of women do the same thing and vice versa, which creates a lot of confusion for everybody. So that's probably the biggest thing is as men, we try to understand women through our own understanding of ourselves, and when women do the same, which that's where controversy and issues come from is that beginning point.
Yeah. And I think that's where I was most of all of my adult life until like the past 6 months when I really started to dive into this content as well, which kind of happened by accident. I just was kind of led into it. But I think you probably remember something that Keyen helped me with was in the past few years, I was really, I mean, I still am really driven, but I had this like deep internal belief of I'm only worthy and lovable if I'm constantly achieving and succeeding at something and hitting new goals. And I had this like deep seated belief that men would love me more if I achieved more, if I did more, if I proved I was worthy. And, you know, come to find that that was actually not working in my favor at all. It was the opposite. And I know that you worked with a lot of women who kind of were in the same mindset as me early on in my business. And I'm wondering if you feel like that is something that can kind of get in the way of dating and women trying to find like the kind of masculine man that a lot of women in this space are looking for.
Yeah, well, the big thing that stuck out to me, Kristen, that you said was that you thought it was going to get you a certain level of love acceptance from a man, but you found out that it was the opposite. I think that's really, really important to dive into and maybe give some context into as well. So there is, you know, a good amount of women that are achieving at very, very high levels, unconsciously or consciously, whether they know it or not, are looking for that level of approval in some way, whether that's a dad's approval or a male figure's approval, that's there. And so we're living in a society that also at the same time very much pushes that way of operating, which is if men can do it, women can do it too. And because men can, women should. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, we'll just look at it as pure biology. Your value in the sexual dating marketplace is not directly correlated with the value that you provide to the world. And actually, it can be inverse in that way. So if you're a high achieving woman and you do believe that your value in the sexual marketplace goes up because you're a higher achiever and you're making more money and you're having more success, that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think a big part of this, and especially for me, and it was probably a lot of it highly unconscious, is that belief that gets kind of conditioned into your brain for a lot of women from really, really young age. I have to prove that I am just as good and can do just as many things as he can so that he respects me. And I was thinking back actually today to when I was in like second grade, we had recitals every year. And the song that we sang was that song of anything you can do, I can do better. And it was the girls singing to the guys. And just this idea in our heads of I need to prove that whatever you can do, I can do too. And not to say that achieving and success is a bad thing. I'm so grateful for it. But my mindset unconsciously around it was this, I need to prove that I'm of equal value so that I'm respected. And come to find that's not how we actually gain respect. And
right. Well, right there, you said in your mind, right? You said equal value,
mm-hmm.
right? So I can see how that would be the case, but the difference between a man and a woman is that the value that we bring to the opposite sex is different, right? So in your mind, it makes sense, right? If a man's doing this thing, that means I can do this same thing. And if I prove that I can do the same thing as him, that will mean my value is equivalent, right? But men and women get value in different ways in the sexual marketplace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is one of the biggest things to begin to understand in this dynamic, right?
Yeah. And so what are the different ways that we bring value? Like what are the dynamics of the differences?
Well, I think we could start with diving into why the value is not the same. And starting with men in the value that they would desire from a dynamic. And I see this a lot. I see guys that will give approval to a woman that is competing in that way and that's pushing really hard because the guy's like, oh, cool, she's working hard. She's trying to make things happen. The competitiveness is kind of fun at first, right? It's almost like a little bit playful. It's like, oh, that's cool. She's doing this and she's pushing hard. But then eventually that drive and ambition to compete against the man gets annoying and starts to chip down at the guy, right? Because so when it starts as something that's, oh, that's cool, she's driven, it doesn't necessarily turn off, and it doesn't turn off. It's hard to go off and on in that for a woman, and so eventually it becomes two men in the dynamic. And if it is a guy that is masculine in his frame, pursuing what he wants, he'll eventually leave that space because he'll get exhausted, or he'll succumb to that frame and fall into some stagnancy and allow her to rise up into that masculine position, which will then mess with the polarity, the sexual polarity in the dynamic, where the woman will become unpleased because she's then the masculine in the dynamic. And unfortunately for most polarity sexually, that doesn't lead to a very happy woman when she sees her man as being less. So one or two things happen. The guy either leaves the circumstance because he's like, yo, I don't want to be with another man. Or the woman ends up leaving and the guy falls into that feminine frame because she's no longer satisfied.